Wednesday. But I'm Andrea Johnson. I am a UU minister affiliated with First Universalist Church in Minneapolis. I did my internship at Unity the church year of 2017-2018. And I went back to United Theological Seminary after serving in Bloomington, Minnesota to work on my Doctor of Ministry. So that's a little bit about me. And I think since we have such a small group, we could at least just speak our name into the space, just so we can hear from everybody. So maybe just say your name and something that brought you here tonight.
Say something.
Well, my name is Jenny Johnson, and this is sitting next to me, Roger Johnson, and I'm interested, and Andrea is our daughter, but I'm interested in this theology, and I don't think I do know, Andrea, what empirical process theology is. So maybe you could do a couple of minutes on that.
Oh, we'll be spending a lot of minutes on that. That's one of the topics for today.
Oh, okay.
How about Beth or Dad? How about Roger? You want to just say your name?
Roger Johnson, and I enjoyed your sermon on Sunday, and I enjoyed the presentation you made last Wednesday. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say today.
Great.
My name is Pat Brown. I'm a friend of Andrea's, and I had the privilege of sort of seeing this dissertation as she wrote it and as it unfolded. And so it's very exciting to me to see her putting her dissertation to work in the community.
Thank you, Pat.
I'll go. My voice is fairly hoarse, but I'm Beth Peterson, and I am curious about the intersection of theology and Martin Luther King and action.
Great. Welcome, Beth.
I'm Sharon, and it also is just curiosity that brought me here.
Awesome. Welcome, Sharon. And Ollie, you're last.
Good, I'm last. Thank you. Well, my name's Ollie Stocker. I've just been attending UU since probably November or something like that. Background, I was very active in the Catholic Church for a long time and familiar with liberation theology and a lot of the social justice outreach work of the Catholic Church and work for social justice. And just having joined UU recently, I was curious as to how that might look in a UU context, or what the background of UU was in terms of social justice and the like. And just want to say hi to Jenny and Roger. I had dinner with them last Wednesday night at Welcome Wednesday, so it's fun seeing them again. Back to you, Andrea.
Oh, you're welcome. Mary?
I think I'm last. I'm Mary, and I am here because a couple of reasons. I'm interested in the interplay of racial justice and UUism, as I think most UUs are. I'm interested in it from a historical perspective because I've done some, light research on the history of UUism and like how that's all gone with like the Black Caucus and the Black and White Alliance. Just the different historical stuff has been interesting for me to learn.
Right.
And then I'm also interested from a theological standpoint, because for me, UUism really informs my politics. Like my spiritual beliefs and my political beliefs are really tied up in each other. So I'm always happy to learn more about that.
Great. We're getting a few more additions. Does the last few people that have come in want to just say their name and something really brief about what's bringing them here tonight?
Hi, I'm Kathleen Rollins, and Wayne Arneson is also here. We're turning our camera off because we're making dinner and we're running late, but I'll turn it on for a minute. We are here because I think your presentation is fantastic and has a lot to offer us and a lot of thoughts to reflect on. So thank you so much for doing this.
Great.
Hello, I'm Elaine Ambrose, and I'm sorry that I'm kind of stuck in I'm really not lying down or whatever it is, and I'm just very interested in this subject. I'm glad that you're doing it.
Great. Welcome, Elaine. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Mike, and I'm viewing because I'm curious and
Great.
always interested in learning. Thank you.
Welcome. All right. Well, I'm going to light a chalice. And I'm going to light our chalice today to honor Martin Luther King, since it was recently his birthday. And we'll be talking about him today, and our UU ancestors who call us to this work. May we live in a way that is worthy of their work and the work that came before us. And may we pass this faith on to the next generation as well. So tonight, here is a brief agenda. I'll do a really brief recap of last week's session for those who weren't here, and just to bring us all up to speed. Then I'll spend about half the time we have together talking about Martin Luther King, his relationship to Unitarian Universalism, and how we can continue to be inspired by his work. We'll talk a little bit about Martin Luther King, and then I'll move on to our second theological trajectory, which is empirical process theology. We'll have some more time for reflection, and then final thoughts and a preview of our final session. So just very briefly, last week we talked about theology and UU history. And so just very briefly, what do I mean by theology? More than God talk, or the interpretation of key doctrines and dogmas. Theology can be broadened to mean the critical and creative reflection on the basic principles of our faith. And our principles are not dogmas and doctrines, but they're diverse teachings, paths, and traditions that can be theistic, they can be atheistic or humanistic. And theology inquires into big questions, the nature of ultimate reality. Some call this God, the sacred mystery, the eternal Tao. Theology can help us articulate a sense of meaning and ethical orientation, and it can help us to envision the world we long to bring into being. So that's a little bit about theology. And then I spent some time talking about our Unitarian history. Again, Unitarianism was the belief in the unity of God, which helps us devote our focus in one place rather than the Trinity. And then our Universalist heritage, very, very briefly, is just that idea that God is love, and a loving God could not damn some to hell. So universalism was about a wide embrace, welcoming and loving all, nobody damned to hell in the afterlife. And I would say now many of us interpret universalism today as solidarity, universal solidarity. No one is outside the circle. So that's a little bit about what we did last week. So now let's talk about Martin Luther King. Oh boy, how do I advance? There we go. So I think in my dissertation, I talk about how we cannot do racial justice work divorced from King's important legacy. And I'm not sure if everybody knows, but he has a relationship with Unitarian Universalism in a couple of various ways. So in 1965, he sent a telegram to our office in Boston calling on clergy, UU clergy, and also other clergy to join him for a minister's march to Montgomery to testify to the fact that the struggle in Selma was for the very survival of our democracy. 179 UU ministers and seminarians journeyed to Selma. And I say in my dissertation that I think in this time, UUs did more than pass yet another resolution. It was a time that included placing one's life at risk. And I think at this time, Selma was about being an authentic relationship to Unitarian Universalist values, promises, and hopes. And perhaps it was a time where we really lived up to and out of the fundamental demands of our faith. And I would say some of those folks perhaps caught a glimpse of the promise of beloved community. Another thing to note is in 1966, so a year later, he spoke at our General Assembly. He gave a lecture called the Ware Lecture, which is a very famous lecture. And our General Assembly that year was held in Florida. There is also another connection. Dr. King did his graduate work in Boston at the university, at Boston University, which was a very liberal university at the time. And also, as you know, Boston was one of the centers of our faith. And there is a story that our president of Starr King Seminary was asked to be one of the to be considered to write Coretta Scott King's autobiography. And during a discussion that Rosemary Bray McNatt had with Coretta Scott King, she recounted this story that Martin and she gave a lot of thought to becoming Unitarian at one time. But Martin and I realized that we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian. So Rosemary was very troubled and saddened by this revelation, and she offers this very sobering quote. She points out that our religious movement may have utterly neutralized the greatest American theologian of the 20th century if he had become Unitarian. Certainly his race would have been a barrier in a religious movement until the 70s. We did not encourage Black people to join our ministerial ranks. But even if race had disappeared as an issue, Rosemary points out that Dr. King may have found the barrier of theology insurmountable. Although he had bent toward liberal religion, by the time his faith had been tried by the civil rights movement, Dr. King had said no to the sunny optimism of liberal faith, an optimism frankly untested in the heat of the battle for liberty and dignity for African Americans. While it is inconceivable for UUs to work toward racial justice or build the beloved community divorced from King's impact, I engage some of the parallels and the divergences in my dissertation and in this presentation between these contrasts, these parallels with our faith and Martin Luther King and some of the divergences. Because I think I don't want to deny the power of his faith tradition, but I also think we cannot, again, as I said earlier, we cannot work for civil rights without King's legacy. And I want to draw out a path that really draws on King's prophetic vision of beloved community that can inspire and really energize our racial justice work. So here are some of the theological parallels between King and Unitarian Universalism. Despite some of the differences in our theologies, both King and Unitarian Universalism is firmly situated in the liberal theological tradition. Martin Luther King describes how, quote, liberalism delivered him from the fundamentalism he grew up with at Ebenezer and set him on the road toward a serious intellectual quest for a method to eliminate social evil. Unitarian Universalism, as we discussed last week, is also very deeply rooted in the liberal tradition and shares with King several core theological values: human dignity, radical love, and the interrelatedness and interdependence of all existence. While contemporary Unitarian Universalists describe itself as a non-creedal pluralistic denomination, its historical roots are traced to the radical Reformation of Christianity in Europe. Like King, our Universalist ancestors believed that a loving God could not damn some to hell, which lays the foundation for our contemporary affirmation of our current first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So you can see that's the first parallel. Dr. King rooted human dignity in a loving, all-powerful, all-good God. And because God loves us, we should love each other. King kind of talked about this personalist theology of the divine in his notion of somebodyness. We are all somebody in the eyes of God, and therefore we should treat each other the same. Olympia Brown, our first woman who was ordained, said that Universalists believe in a God of love who will reconcile all. And this too can ground our first principle, human dignity. The centrality of radical love is also foundational for both King's theology and Universalist legacy of a belief in a God who saves all. That's radical love. Both view divine love and grace as universal, which gives rise to an ethic of love and compassion that extends beyond individual morality to the communal work of social justice. So King talked about agape love, not filial love, not romantic love, but love of God with the aim of creating the beloved community and liberation of the oppressed. And he definitely talked about how society must be radically altered by agape love. And an example of that radical love in universalism is Clarence Skinner. He interprets universalism as a practical philosophy that promotes social engagement and justice. Sin, he said, is not just personal, but systemic and structural. Society has to become the subject of redemption and salvation. So again, a lot of religions were focused on individual morality. King and Universalists and Unitarians were focused on individual morality, but more importantly, systemic reality as well, and bringing their faith into the public square. And finally, interdependence. King talked about how our destiny is tied up with the destiny of every other nation. Humanity is inescapably bound together in a network of mutuality. And I think no one better than King really describes what that interdependence and network of mutuality really can look like. And I think Unitarian Universalism picked that up in our seventh principle, which is the respect for the interdependent web of all existence. So these are some of the parallels between King and Unitarian Universalism that we can use and be inspired by, because these are the things that we agree on. But I don't want to gloss over the divergences. So here are some of the divergences. Although historic Universalism and Unitarianism both described God as love, most contemporary UUs no longer believe in a personal God who is all loving and all good, because this belief requires a theodicy. Theodicy is just a fancy word for saying, how can an all good, powerful God exist when there's so much evil in the world? How do you reconcile those two things? So one might even argue, along with African-American and Unitarian Universalist theologian William R. Jones, that history clearly demonstrates that suffering falls disproportionately on oppressed Black people, giving rise to his claim that God could even be considered a white racist. So that's a bold claim, but I think that we can't gloss over that in Unitarian Universalism. I think many of us come to this faith exactly because we find it hard to reconcile these two things, evil and an all personal, all loving God. The second divergence is, one of Martin Luther King's most famous ideas is that there's a moral arc to the universe and it bends towards justice. I think that UUs, again, don't necessarily believe in an all-powerful God that has an end goal for us in the afterlife or even here. UUs might find it more authentic to say that the moral arc of the universe may or may not bend to justice on its own, but in the human realm, we can act to make such an arc possible by choosing to live and create justice here on earth. And then finally, redemptive suffering. King highlighted the efficacy of redemptive suffering. He asked his people to undergo beatings and, pointed to Jesus's redemptive suffering on the cross as a way of achieving beloved community. I think that's also hard for many Unitarian Universalists. Because the price of psychological and physical harm to Black people or anyone, framed by this theology as a form of redemption, is just too costly to bear. Feminist theologians Rita Nakashima-Brock and Rebecca Parker explain that when Christians identify the central story of their faith as the intentional sacrifice of a beloved son by God, his own father, they unwittingly make a story about child abuse into a narrative of salvation that can trap those most vulnerable to violence, namely women and children. However, while Unitarian Universalists reject the efficacy of the concept of redemptive suffering, many wholeheartedly embrace King's unwavering commitment to nonviolence as a means of achieving beloved community. So in so doing, I think we UUs can walk a path of precarious balance, bearing the suffering so often embedded in nonviolent resistance, while adamantly refusing to glorify such suffering as inherently redemptive. So those are some of the divergences that I think we can still overcome and be inspired by his work. I want to point to something. I think many of you know that we're working on this article too. We're redoing our principles into this new symbol that you see on the slide, and we're focusing on putting love at the center of our faith. This is a quote from this report that the UUA Board of Trustees really is encouraging us to do. The UUA board, they say that our commitment to personal, institutional, and cultural change rooted in anti-oppression, anti-racism, values and practices love in action. And they say that love in action should guide us in the transformation of ourselves, our communities, and our faith into active networks of collective care, restoration, and justice. Love in action should challenge UUs to place liberation in all its dimensions at the center of our lives. I think this is exactly what Martin Luther King is calling us to do. So Martin Luther King, drawing on his work, can helps us show us what love at the center really looks like. So the next part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about what's a practical way that we can put Martin Luther King's theology into practice. And one of those is police abolition work. Now, before you get maybe triggered by that word, just bear with me. I know that police abolition is contentious within Unitarian Universalism, but I'm going to help unpack this for you, so stay with me. I think that one concrete manifestation of love and interdependence is the work of abolition. I would argue that transforming our communities into active networks of collective care, restoration, and transformative justice, that quote I read earlier, is exactly the clarion call of the current abolition movement, and can provide UUs with a timely and urgent opportunity to place Black liberation at the center of our lives. Investing in solutions that increase public safety may be our last chance to choose community over chaos. That was one of the lines in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. He is urging us not to take the moderate path of peace, but to do the real work of transformation. And this is what I think the police abolition movement is really calling us to do. The time could be now to reduce the size, budgets, and power of all institutions that surveil, police, punish, incarcerate, and kill Black people, and instead start investing in and building new community infrastructures that will produce genuine safety and sustainability for our communities. Now, I seek to make clear that I don't mean to conflate the beloved community with police abolition, nor do I mean to imply that if one disagrees with police abolition, one is against the building of beloved community. Critically, I actually would push back strongly against abolition becoming an end in itself, for that would make abolition an idol, as our human projects can so easily become. Furthermore, though, I contend that those who advocate for abolition are not suggesting we get rid of the police and leave everything else the same. They are advocating that we attend to other crucial aspects of community safety, such as healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. So we can't abolish the police unless we have healthcare, education, economic opportunities for all. Engaging abolition as a realistic political strategy requires us to think far bigger, socially, culturally, and structurally, so that we can create a society in which policing, the systems that help a community manage conflict and bodily safety, would look radically different than they do today. I believe that abolition could be a necessary waypoint on a longer and bigger journey toward wholeness and communion with one another and with the divine. So what I'm trying to do, again, just to summarize Martin Luther King, I think we can build on his legacy and these incredibly beautiful and powerful concepts of radical love, of the interdependent web, inherent dignity of every person. And we can use King's legacy and these theological concepts to ground our racial justice work. And abolition is one such program. And I'm not saying this is the only program. Obviously, we can do many things using King's legacy, but this is one example. So that ends my my King presentation. So I'm kind of curious. That was a lot of information. So maybe we could just take a moment. Looks like we've got about 14 people on the line. So everyone does not have to participate, but if there's something that bubbles up and inspires you from King's legacy, I would invite you just to share, just unmute yourself and share what's coming to mind for you. Or you can also ask me any questions about King or King's legacy or anything like that. And then we'll move on to empirical process theology, our second trajectory. It's okay if you're shy. I can just move on.
All right, I can start. This is Peter. Can you hear me?
Yep, go for it, Peter.
Great. Well, in full disclosure, I don't have my camera on because I'm on a dog walk.
That's fine.
So that's why if I sound like I'm walking, it's because I am. I really loved your presentation on King. I completely agree. I think I've come to a lot of similar conclusions in my reading of his works, and I appreciate your synthesis of all of that very much. And I think one of the things that really bubbled up for me, and I wrote it down, is some of the UU principles. Just sort of the trajectory of your thesis is interesting to me, because I've come back to Unitarianism as sort of my own journey of what for me it means to be a Unitarian. And so learning from you now tonight is sort of helping me better understand how to construct all that. So that's one thing that's bubbled up. But you also talked about reconciling evil with a personal living God, the idea of redemptive suffering. Those are things I really resonate with. Already that's been part of my own spiritual maturing and understanding. And I find a lot of validation in what you're talking about, because I read Afrocentric theology and history and science as a way to understand the problem of America. And I've been doing that for 20 years as a student, and now a social worker, and now a therapist and an activist, and a person who has spent time on the front lines of the protests that occurred in police violence. And so I'm appreciative of how cogent or how thoughtful your thesis is. And it's also sort of startling to me, like one of the reasons that I think I ran from Unitarianism when I was a kid is that I just sort of always accepted King's thesis. I read it, and now I read Alfred Cohen and I read others. And I just that's America. I mean, that's not African American. I mean, I'm a white guy who, in all intents and purposes, have privilege, plenty of it. But I have an immigrant story. I have significant suffering in my life that I continue to live with, and it's been part and parcel of my understanding. And I understand myself as an American, and I happen to be white, and I happen to have a lot of privilege, and I also know what I have witnessed and walked with enough people who've said this is what my experience is, and you pay attention, you read the science. So I'm appreciating this conversation very much, and I'll finish by saying that I don't think there's a problem reconciling evil and personal and a living God. To me, it's God is like suffering is, and evil happens, and it's just part of life, and that God is our relationship to each other and how we sustain ourselves through that. And so the suffering that happens by the hands of the police is bad policing. That's why we want to abolish that whole idea. And because I work with the police, I call the police regularly for my work, and I interface with them, and I've met very good ones. And so it's not an either or situation to me. It's both. So we don't get evil exists, suffering exists, but the love and the beloved community is what sustains us. So thanks so much for the conversation.
Wow, thank you, Peter. Thank you for sharing. That is very wonderful thoughts you have here, and I'm so glad that you're inspired by King and that you can see some of these connections between our UU faith and King. Because yeah, it's really obvious to me, and I resonate with that too. I remember learning about King growing up, and his concepts and words and the way he lived his life are so inspiring still to me today.
Hey, Andrea, you got time for one more question? It's Wayne Arneson.
For sure.
I'll try and get away from the lights so that I'm a little more visible. So I'm interested in your own study of King's evolution theologically and how it was reflected in the political directions he went towards the end of his life, and its relationship to Unitarian Universalist theology in this sense. He, towards the end of his life, started to focus on economic justice and on systemic issues that disadvantaged poor people. And he was moving in a direction of liberation theology, I think. And at the beginning, though, Unitarian Universalists were very excited about participating with Dr. King because we were inspired by the theology of the worth and dignity of all people, which is very simpatico with a civil rights-based movement that is focused on voting rights, on just generally personal freedom. But it's a whole different thing at the end of his life when he's the emblematic thing is going to Mississippi for a garbage workers strike. Rather than a voting issue. And we sort of followed him in that direction, but not as widely and enthusiastically. In my own research, I turned up one General Assembly resolution that reflected the Poor People's Campaign work after his death. But we haven't gone in that direction as strongly. I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
Oh boy, those are great questions. I maybe don't know. I don't maybe know as much as you do about this specific thing with the General Assembly resolution, but I do agree that as his thought evolved, it was more and more radical, right? We hear about the radical King, and I think he understood this interdependence and the interdependence of how these systems worked. And I think you're right. Our faith, our movement maybe didn't live up to its proclamations as well as we could have. We could have, I don't know what we did on Vietnam, but like he was, at the end of his life, he started saying we should get out of Vietnam. And I haven't delved into that history with Unitarian Universalism, but we didn't follow King as into some more of his radical thought as we maybe could have. And that's kind of what I'm pointing out with police abolition. It's pretty radical. People think police abolition is very radical, but if you break it down, it's King's vision. It's looking at all of these pieces and how they relate to making our society better and more of a beloved community than it is now. I didn't really answer your question very well, but I would like to.
You
That would
did.
be interesting to weave that in more. I could probably make that connection even stronger in my dissertation. So that would
Thank
be
you.
interesting to add. Anybody else have any thoughts?
This is Mary.
Go
I
for it.
thought that it was super interesting to hear about like the tension between UU theology not glorifying suffering as redemptive, and then like nonviolent approaches for their political power often are kind of requiring people to suffer violence very publicly.
Yes.
And that really spoke to me because that tension like exists for me in what I've seen and what I've even just seen in the past few years. I've definitely leaned a lot further away from like this sort of complete emphasis on nonviolence and like the idea that if people see suffering publicly, they will be moved to do something about it. That's been kind of completely it's been undermined for sure for
Yep.
me. And so it was interesting to hear about that from a theological perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think some movements are maybe not saying, some movements might even say violence might be necessary. I don't think so, but I have heard some say that it might be. So it's an interesting question. Yeah, redemptive suffering. Yeah. Anyway, any other thoughts?
I'll just throw in, I really enjoyed your talk, Andrea, and the thing that really struck me, you mentioned about the need for equality of health, education, and economic opportunity. And to me, that's the nuts and bolts of it. Until we can somewhat as a society find effective ways to bring about equality in those three areas, I think we're going to continue to have problems. It's when people get a chance to work, they feel, there's a great sense of self-esteem, they build a family and so forth. I mean, those are critical things. I think those are like building blocks of the kind of social justice thing that we need to do. And I think if those get accomplished, there would be less need for policing. I don't think that would be as much of an issue. And but those aren't easy tasks. I think we've talked about those forever. But to me, that's where the rubber meets the road, those three areas. Thank you.
One area I remember thinking about when I was writing this chapter that I could have gone, and Dr. Gary Green is a African-American professor at United Theological Seminary where I did my doctorate. I remember talking to him about this. Martin Luther King was also pushing for possibly like really dismantling some of the capitalistic structures. I haven't talked about this, but another radical way to embody King's legacy is to really look at capitalism and how it's destroying our planet and consumerism and things like that. Maybe democratic socialism would be a more effective governmental model. What would it take to, really look at colonialism and some of that. That's another area I could explore in my dissertation that I didn't, but I think King could also push us in that direction as well. I'm going to move us on to empirical process theology. We'll have some more time for questions at the very end, but this is is some dense theology that I'm going to unpack. So I hope you can bear with me, because it's very beautiful and it also has some profound implications for justice work, in my opinion. I'm gonna keep using it down button. Okay. So empirical process theology. Bernard Loomer. Bernard Loomer was a late convert to Unitarian Universalism at the end of his life. He was a dean and theology professor at Chicago Divinity School in Chicago. And he didn't write a lot because he was busy being a dean. But the one essay, The Size of God, that he wrote more than that, but that's kind of his very mature thought, I think is very profound and beautiful. So I'm going to unpack some of this theology for you. So we're going to shift from King's personalistic view of the divine. So I didn't kind of go over my dissertation, but I talked about it last week, where I have these 4 different theological trajectories, and each offers a different way of imagining the divine. So if personal God, good God theology doesn't work for you, Bernard Loomer and process theology offers another way of imagining the divine, and I'm going to unpack that for you. So Loomer's theology is based on something called process relational philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. And the nuts and bolts of this theology, or philosophy actually, is that everything in existence is in process, and everything in existence is constituted by its relationships. The primordial fact of our existence is that we do not become interdependent, but rather we are interdependent from our inception. These are the ever-present and inescapable structures of life itself. So Loomer is also a naturalist. He doesn't believe in supernatural revelation. He says that the world is self-sufficient, meaning nobody created it. It's just self-sufficient with respect to causes, explanations, and resources. And just a very quick summary, he opts for a model of God that divinizes the totality of this concrete, experienceable, ambiguous, and interrelated world. So he takes this universe and this world and he calls it God. And I argue in this part of my dissertation that adopting Loomer's big God, a God that is metaphysically and religiously ultimate, morally ambiguous, can help orient ourselves in the universe and order our justice commitments and values. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit now in a little bit more detail. So here's a little bit more about this process theology. Metaphysics investigates what to be means. That's what metaphysics is. What does it mean to be? What universal and general principles are exemplified in anything that is? What are the broad concepts that help us define reality? Its patterns, its features, its characteristics, its values and potentialities, as well as our understanding and assumptions about what it means to be human and alive in the natural world. So process theology is compatible with modern science because it's based on this understanding that process and relationality, or becoming, is the basic and inclusive metaphysical category, rather than being or substance. So being or substance kind of dates back to Plato, things that are static. This philosophy says that no, it's not static. What existence really is made up of is movement and relationships and being, or becoming rather than being. So reality is more like a living, feeling organism than an inorganic object. And this philosophy is fully naturalistic because it doesn't say there's a supernatural afterlife, or there's something that can break into the natural processes. So the one world, I think I said this on the last slide, the experienceable world with all of its possibilities, the interconnected web of natural relations and events, is the only reality there is. So the reason I think this is so compelling is because I think this lines up very closely with Unitarian Universalism. because it de-emphasizes supernatural revelation. And I think a lot of UUs are naturalistic in their orientation. So let's talk a little bit more about interrelatedness and interdependence. These, again, are two of the cornerstones of this philosophy. And here's a nice quote from Loomer that his sort of take on this. So we live in society, but our society also literally lives within us. We feed on each other in all the dimensions of our lives. That's the relationality part of this philosophy. We create each other. We live within interlaced fields of energy or relational webs of interconnectedness. We're created within these fields, and the possibilities emerge from our interrelationships. We create the web, and the web creates us. Within this relational web, we are also self-creative and thereby transform the web for better or worse. So if you think about a web, it's not all good. It contains beauty and pain and evil, creation and destruction, all of it. Okay, so that's a little bit about this process philosophy. Now I want to move into, so what does Loomer do? If this process and relations and being over or becoming over being is kind of what the world is really like, Loomer is a pantheist. So he's taking this whole world and he's saying it's divine. So it's empirical because to describe the world as best we can, he chooses to name God because that's formed within our experienceable world. So he opts for this model of God, like I said, that divinizes the totality of this concrete, experienceable, ambiguous web. And he says God is the organic restlessness of the whole body of creation. I'm just going to repeat that. I think that's a beautiful phrase. God is the organic restlessness of the whole body of creation. So his view of God is a metaphor of ultimacy that is most adequate for describing the natural reality we experience all around us. So why I think this is important is that it's a concrete God. It's a real God, an abstraction. To say God is just the good, some theologians say God is just the processes that promote the good. But that's an abstraction because that's not the reality we see all around us. We see evil, waste, creativity, destruction. Loomer is really saying, no, I want to call God the ambiguous world that we really experience. Okay. For Loomer, a living, dynamic, and active God, in short, a concrete God, is of greater size and stature than any mere abstraction could achieve. Okay. Again, I've said this before, but if God is none other than the interconnected totality of this struggling, imperfect, unfinished, and evolving societal web, then God has to include all the ambiguity actually found in the world. Creativity and destructiveness, order and disorder, novelty and repetition, meaning and meaninglessness, beauty and grotesqueness. In other words, Loomer fully embraces pantheism and follows it through to its logical conclusion. A God that is truly concrete and empirical must have a dark side, a Shiva side, a shadow side. Okay, okay. Okay. In my experience as a Unitarian Universalist minister, acknowledging that ambiguity lies at the very heart of reality adds depth, richness, and vitality to congregational life. An unambiguous God would be much flatter and far less complex, less interesting than the life we actually have, a life that is inescapably ambiguous. So this recognition of ambiguity for me as a minister, I think helps me speak the truth in love. For example, when I preach on the mixed record of our denomination when it comes to working for racial justice and dismantling white supremacy culture, that would be one example. We see ambiguousness in our faith tradition and the world around us. So I think this idea of God can help really ground us. So I'm going to keep going, but I'm going to say more about this. But so you might be wondering, why deify the interconnected web by calling it God? Why not just say we live in this ambiguous web and it's interdependent? And here's Loomer's answer. Because in our religious traditions, the term God is the symbol of ultimate values and meanings in all of their dimensions. It connotes an absolute claim on our loyalty. The world is God because it's the source and preserver of meaning. It's the creative advance of the world. The world is holy ground, and because it contains and enshrouds the ultimate mystery inherent within existence itself. God symbolizes this mystery, Loomer says. The world and all of the dimensions of its being is the basis for all our wonder, awe, and inquiry. When I first learned about this theology when I was studying my MDiv, it transformed my life. It grounds me and it helps take me out of the little world of Andrea and get into, feel connected to the whole universe in all of its ambiguousness. Another way that it grounds my life and my spiritual practices is using another theologian called Paul Tillich, his language of ultimate concern and ultimate reality. He says that we all believe something is ultimate. You look for what someone believes is ultimate, and that's God for them. So things that are not truly ultimate would be like if all I cared about was money or power, or if I'm a Nazi and all I care about is the white race. Those things would be penultimate concerns because they're finite, they end, they're conditional. A truly ultimate concern is that which determines our being, whether we live or die. So for me, I want to understand what's ultimate, and I want to name that God. So what's ultimate is nature. Nature is what determines whether we live or die. So that is an object that is worthy of our reverence, our awe. That is worthy to be called God, in my opinion, because it determines whether we live or die. So for me, it fulfills that definition of a truly ultimate concern and can help relativize this humanity, the anthropocentric nature of what it means to be human. It helps me realize that the world doesn't revolve around me. I need to be concerned with the world itself in this ecological age and all the bodies and things in the world. I don't know if I'm explaining that well enough, but the divine bigness of the world invites me to recognize my human smallness, a virtue that's especially pertinent for our climate crisis. It helps me understand that nature is the measure, not humanity. In pantheism, humanity assumes its rightful place within the vast expanse of nature, and nature is seen as our home. This view of God helps us be in right relationship with nature and all of the creatures contained therein. So that's why this theology is so powerful for me. All right. Couple more slides and then we'll have some time to talk about this. Okay, so what are some ethical fruits of this theology? So if you're a pantheist like me, how does this ground our ethical life? I read this quote in the sermon on Sunday, if you were there. Loomer points this out. Love is an acknowledgement of our interrelatedness and our interconnectedness. We love because we are interdependent, because we enter into each other's lives. Love does not create our essential relatedness. Love is an acknowledgement of it. We love because we are bound to each other. We are fulfilled in and with and through each other. And we love because a failure to love is a denial of the other, ourselves, and our relatedness. So we diminish God if we don't love. I actually write in my dissertation that to love is to say that God exists. So again, this is, very much mirrors King. It's a way of sort of naturalizing King's idea of love. And also, again, the inherent worth and dignity of all people is embedded in this idea of interrelatedness and interconnection. So why do we work for justice? Because we are interdependent and we are interrelated. So yes, when we reach out toward the other in compassion, we acknowledge our oneness with the other. His suffering becomes in part our suffering. Her impoverishment diminishes us. In responding appropriately to the other, we are both fulfilled through that act, and life within the web of relationships is advanced. So that's the first ethical fruit of this theology. It can ground our justice work and especially our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Second ethical fruit is, I think this theology can help us with our spiritual practice. Loomer talks about that to be spiritually mature is to grow the size of our souls. And he always wrote the word size with dashes and in capital letters to sort of connotate the meaning of this. And by size, he says the volume of life that you can take into your being and still maintain your integrity and individuality. The intensity and variety of outlook that you can entertain in the unity of your being without feeling defensive or insecure. The strength of your spirit to encourage others to become freer in the development of their diversity and uniqueness. I mean the power to sustain ever more complex and enriching tensions. So this to me really goes along with the ambiguous God. If there's so many, especially in racial justice work, it's if you're white, it's uncovering the layers of racial, the history of oppression in the U.S. can make us feel shame. We can struggle with wanting to feel proud of our country and patriotic and knowing its incredibly difficult history. So I think this idea of God and this idea of growing the size of our souls helps us not resist the reality of this. It helps us see the truth and just have more acceptance of the world as it is. Just looking at my notes here. So again, growing the size of our souls could mean bringing into consciousness and concern all the interrelationships of the web in which we live, even those with whom we disagree or find morally repugnant. Maybe we can think of Trump in this way. As we uncover the tragedies and devastation of systemic oppression and injustice, the work of racial justice can be complicated, like I said, and can bring up feelings of sadness. For those of us who are white, shame and hopelessness can arise when we learn of our own complicity in these systems. Growing our souls involves practicing and receiving this complexity, accepting it, and allowing it to be connected to our own story, to impact, shift, and inform our own complexity. My wager of faith is that growing the size of our collective souls will also help our congregations become a more diverse and inclusive community by helping us open up spaces for relationship, for accountability, invention, and critique. Growing the size of our soul will help us work toward embracing a more complex sense of identity, one that incorporates both pride and accountability. There is more to be gained in acting for justice than maintaining individual or group dominance. There is a richer self, a more rewarding group identity to be gained through open-ended pluralism than through tightly defined exclusivity. The challenge, though, is not one of sacrificing power, access, and group belonging. but rather of constituting a richer form of group and self-identity, using power to facilitate diversity and ongoing self-critique rather than to maintain control. I think what our faith as UUs asks of us, what it imagines for us, is that when our hearts break, we will find our way to see through that heartbreak. We will stay put, not close off, not run away, not hurt back, but keep on being in relationship, doing what we can to repair ourselves, each other, and the world. So I like to think of this size as what spiritual practices can help us. This is the heart of spiritual practice, in my opinion. Prayer, meditation, whatever it is for you. It's to soften your heart without breaking it, but softening it so you can let in these experiences and the reality of the world we live in and keep going. I hope that makes some sense. So that's what I have about Loomer. And so I'm wondering, I know that's dense, it's a lot of words, it's a lot of philosophy, but I think it's so beautiful. And I'm wondering if anything I said resonates or inspires you from this idea of process theology. And do you have any questions or final reflections or thoughts about either King or Loomer as we bring tonight to a close? But we have plenty of time for discussion, so I invite anyone to jump in. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, actually. Let me do that, and I can see all your faces a bit better. There we go.
Well, one quick thing, how does Loomer address the issue of evil in the world and pain?
He just says it exists, right?
It just exists.
It just is. It's not caused from, you know, a dualistic view of the world where there's an evil force and a good God. Nope. Evil and suffering are just intertwined. It's part of the fabric of the world. It's just built into the fabric of life. And we see it in nature, right? We see species extinctions. We see, you know, the whole process of evolution kind of shows us this, right? Nothing is outside of the divine life. That's another way of saying it. Everything is included in the divine life. How would this, here's a
Reverend Doctor?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I've been trying to work up the courage to call you that since I saw you with that in your title, because I think it's a great title. We should just call you, you should get a Reverend Doctor. I know I really, gosh, I feel like I want to buy your book. Like everything you're saying, I guess it's validation. I feel like you and I read similar books or been trajectorily shot in a similar direction as, you know, theologically. I'm not sure, but I just find everything you say kind of like, I'm like, oh yeah, I've thought about that. I've thought it that way, and I'm inspired by this conversation. I want to continue. I would like to listen to it more, and I look forward to reading your dissertation more.
Great.
I think one of the things I'm struck by, and I guess this is something maybe where I struggle in my connection, is I've never thought of God as an individual, concrete thing, and I've always struggled with that. Like that's a lot of people seem to have that belief, and so I've always been able to stay. I'm good with the ambiguous God. I think, because it really makes sense to me about how my experience of the world works, is that there's suffering and joy, and you know, and so I appreciate the conversation so much. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. It's so heartening to hear that this is resonating. It totally resonated for me when I went to seminary. Because yeah, an all good God, a being called God, it feels like a category mistake. Like that's too small. Like God is bigger than that.
So Andrea, I appreciate this because it's pretty much what I wrote in my personal theology statement for teaching associates. But I came at it from a different direction, from both Carl Sagan and Octavia Butler.
Oh, I love that.
So
Yeah.
I'm really curious about reading Loomer because he articulates it so much better than I did. And I also am sort of intrigued by his deciding to call this, whatever it is, God, because I struggle with that.
Oh,
Because so many other people's idea of God is so narrow, and mine is more based on the Tao idea that what we can know of the Tao is not the real Tao.
Yep.
Because we as human beings can't imagine the immensity of it. So I appreciate hearing this.
That's what resonates for me too. There's a lot of mystery is contained in here. We can make space for that mystery and all the things that we don't know. Yeah, it's very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say, Andrea, thank you for doing this. I so appreciate it. And because you're my daughter, I've been on this journey and heard all of this many times, but I think when you talked about several years ago about God being nature, it was so freeing for me because the guy in the sky just doesn't cut it.
I know there's a lot of theological debates. Do you just go full-blown atheism, or do you divinize nature and call it God? And I mean, functionally, many of us, I feel functionally a humanist, right? I have this view of God, but I do think it's up to us to bend that arc toward justice. But there's something in me, I don't know if it's a gut thing or just an orientation. I was born this way, but there's something about calling nature God that grounds my life. And so I don't want to give up on the symbol God. And I don't, like you said, Tom, I don't want to cede it to just people that believe in a personal God. I use the word pantheist. I say I'm a pantheist. Now, a lot of people would say that's just, Richard Dawkins calls that sexed up atheism, but I disagree. Like I don't agree. It's more than sexed up atheism for me. And it's taken me a lot of years of study to try to articulate all of this, but I'm still like fascinated by these debates in philosophy and theology, and I want to learn more. I could tell you about a lot of other authors. Wesley Wildman is a wonderful author, Don Crosby. There's a lot of religious naturalists that talk about these ideas, and some use God language and some don't, and I find many of them very, very compelling. You're muted, Wayne.
I'm guessing you've given some thought to the difference between the way you've articulated your process theology view and your comfort with using the word God, in contrast with Buddhist theologies, which are so similar, it seems to me, in so many ways to process theology, but decide that other than for conversational purposes as a metaphor that is interesting to use, they're not really going to use God. And it's seen as a non-theistic religion. Have you got any short reflections about anything distinctly different that you see it in process theology from what you know about Buddhist theologies?
I'm not a Buddhism expert. I don't know if I have a very good answer for that, although I do see the intersections, like the idea of non-attachment in Buddhism kind of goes along with this ambiguous God that includes all of the waste and the creativity, the joy and the beauty and the suffering and repetitiveness, I think it helps with that idea of non-attachment. We right size ourselves, we surrender. It's a way of surrendering. Not in a bad way, but in that, because I don't know, for my personality, I want to control everything. I want to think I can control it, and we can't. We can't control everything in our life. So this idea of God helps me surrender a little bit. Other ideas do this too, but like even the thought of justice, working so hard for justice. I'm not going to see racial justice get resolved in my lifetime, but that doesn't stop me from trying and working. And with that non-attachment, I can just let go of the outcome a little bit and just keep doing my part to bend the moral arc. That
Theologically, you might be interested to delve a little more into the way that Buddhists think about the interdependent web of causality, and the way that so much reflects Loomer's view of the natural world as all interconnected, and that interconnection is the heart of the matter. So I'll just note that similarity for those who have Buddhist interests as well.
I think if I had a fifth trajectory in my dissertation, I would love to do some kind of comparative theology. I think that's a great idea. Like, what does comparative theology teach us? And I couldn't write about everything, but these were just 4. But I like that idea. I think there could be a lot of richness there. And Buddhism is a lot of you Unitarians, Universalists really resonate with Buddhism. I think that's one of our key sources for sure. So yes, I would love to explore that.
Thanks.
Great. This is great. We can certainly keep chatting a little bit if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, we do have one more session next Tuesday at the same time with the same Zoom link. And the topic is African American naturalistic humanism. And I did write about a 4th trajectory in my dissertation, feminist theology. Sharon Welsh is actually one of our UU theologians, and I wrote a chapter on her. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to have time to talk about both, but I think I will. I would really like to talk about Sharon Welsh next week. So I'm going to spend probably most of the time on African American naturalistic humanism. But I want to leave some time to talk about Sharon Welsh because she is so important, and she is a living UU theologian who I really just fell more and more in love with as I read her work. Every time I read her work, I get more out of it. So I want to share that with you too next week. So if you want, you can just browse chapters 3 and 4 of my dissertation. If not, it's fine. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to unpack the tenets of each of these theologies. I'm going to apply them to some specific racial justice work, kind of talk about what I'm calling these ethical fruits of these theologies and how they can help us in our work. So next week will be very similar to this week.
Andrea, it's Clover.
Yes.
I just have a quick question about your trajectories, the 4 trajectories that you landed on in terms of your work, and curious about how many trajectories might you have had, and how did you come back to or land with these 4?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my dissertation, kind of in the beginning and the end, I basically say these are just 4 trajectories. This is a starting point. So again, if you remember from last week, that important document, Widening of the Circle of Concern, basically, I'm responding to that. In that document, it says we haven't invested in theological resources. We need to articulate more theologies to help us. And so here's my stab at it. One Andrea Johnson, writing a dissertation with 4 trajectories. And I call on my colleagues, lay and ministers, to add to this body. I would love to, like Wayne, God, it'd be great to work with you. You probably have some ideas. Like, it would be so fun to get a bunch of ministers together. And what other resources are there? What other trajectories could we delve into? Be fun to create like a database or reading group, ministers coming together to talk about these things and how they could be used. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but more trajectories. I picked these because firstly, they're different ways of imagining the divine. So Martin Luther King, personal God, theism. Loomer, if you still want to hang on to God, but you need a different way of imagining God, that's Loomer. Humanism, so we're going to give up God entirely. Anthony Pinn, African-American humanist, is going to say, God has outlived its usefulness, get rid of it. How does that ground our racial justice work? He has some wonderful metaphors about Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, love Pinn. And then Sharon Welsh is, I would say, also very humanistic now. Her theology kind of morphs, but she kind of early in her theology says where there is liberation, that's divine. So, and is also, it's up to us. Anyway, so I just sort of tried to pick theological trajectories that were complementary and different because we're such a pluralistic movement. But I think Buddhism could ground our work. I think there's a lot of Jewish resources. Jewish writers writing after the Holocaust. One is Richard Rubinstein. I think his theology is just some of the most beautiful theology I've ever heard in my life. I would love to write, I could see writing a trajectory on him or on that strand. I mean, it's really endless. So I'm not giving you a very concrete list, but that Jewish theology, comparative theology. I think we could find some things in Buddhism. What else, Pat? What am I missing? You're a fellow theological traveler. I mean, the possibilities are endless. There's so many. Ground of being, like Paul Tillich, ground of being and pantheism is kind of similar, but there's nuances. So I think you could separate ground of being out from pantheism, and that could be Wesley Wildman and Paul Tillich, and you could do more religious naturalism without any God. So Loomer keeps God, Don Crosby. So like you could pick apart the nuances and probably come up with, I'm sure I could come up with like another 4, just what I just said now.
Great. Thank you.
I'm sure there's other like
really helpful. And I have a feeling that you will be writing more and working with others to keep this work alive. And so this has been really interesting. Thank you so much.
If I could have whatever I wanted, it would be, I would love to just be employed as like a theologian for the UUA or something, but no such thing exists. But I would love to just, keep this going and work with others. I don't want to just be in my own bubble, though. I would really like to find some like-minded people to work with. But this is just a starting point. And yes, thank you for all your attention and your wonderful questions. And I'm glad this has been touching and meaningful for you. Does anyone have any last words that they would really wish to speak into the room? No? Otherwise, great. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see as many of you as would like to come next week.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.